me. I'm Christine Turco. I'm the cognitive psychologist of the department. I'm going to talk first about what cognitive psychology is as a discipline, and then I'll talk to you about how I became a cognitive psychologist. It was not like I was a kid that told people when they asked what I was going to be when I grew up that I would be a cognitive psychologist. I didn't even know what that was really until I was probably 19 years old. So it took a long time for me to figure that out, and I think you're finding, at least from most of the other speakers who you've heard from this semester, that that's pretty common. So does anyone know what cognitive psychology is? Do you ever hear the word cognition? When do you hear that word? We hear it used to describe people sometimes. Like their cognitive skills are strong, or their cognitive skills are impaired. Yeah?
Isn't it like a thinking process or something?
Yeah, thinking processes. In the most general sense, we can think of cognition as thought processes. I took a definition from a book. So there's a textbook, and the author defines cognition as a scientific study of knowledge. That's a really, really broad topic. So it's not just the study. This makes it sound pretty static. It makes it sound like cognitive psychologists are out there studying what people have in their brain. That's a part of it. We want to know what people hold on to, how people hold on to information in the brain, but we also want to know how we process the information, and that's really important. So cognitive psychologists are very interested in internal mental processes like problem solving, like memory and language. Attention is also something that cognitive psychologists give a lot of focus to. Anything that helps us understand how we take information in from our surrounding and make sense of it, how we hold on to it, and are able to use it successfully at a later time. So it's a lot of stuff. Cognitive psychologists don't do all of it. So as a discipline, we learn about cognitive psychology and the processes generally, and then we choose usually one or sometimes two of those to focus on as a career. So I'll talk about that more in a little bit. There's been a lot of recent development with cognitive psychology, and I'm not talking recent like this year, I'm talking over the last 20 years, as a discipline, recent development. Part of that is because there was a period of time when cognitive psychology fell out of favor. So cognitive psychology became an official discipline. It's pretty new, like in the early 1900s. People started to study it, were really interested, especially in things like memory. But the way that they went about studying it was a little bit odd. The way that the founding fathers of cognitive psychology, so Wilhelm Wundt was one of them, they would go and ask people, so tell me, when you talk to me, what is your brain doing? They used this method called introspection. They tried to get people to reflect on what was going on internally as they did something cognitively. It's almost impossible to do. Think about that. Thinking about thinking. It's difficult. Do you know what your brain is doing while you're talking? I mean, I think the most I could say, without knowing what I know, is how that works, what steps are being taken, how those steps work together. So that was really interesting. It was a really interesting idea, but it was almost more of a philosophical idea than it was a scientific, psychological idea, because it was very difficult to measure. So because of that fact, cognitive discipline, it wasn't supported by the scientific community as much, and instead it was replaced, temporarily at least, by a sub-area called behaviorism. And Dr. Muller looks at behaviorism and what happens when we study outward behavior. It's looking at the cause of behavior and what behavior enables us to do. So what changes behavior, what our behaviors allow us to do. Operant and classical conditioning. So people argued for a long time, and we're talking like the 30s through the 70s, behavior was really kind of like the hot area. And then all of a sudden, because of advances in technology, things like the computer, so in the 70s, computers aren't like they are now, but people were starting to use the computer as a metaphor. So the computer stores information, and then computer programmers are able to manipulate the information and get something else out. And psychologists started to realize, hey, we can use that as a metaphor for the mind. Information comes into our brain through our senses. We process that information, and then we use that in some way, some meaningful way. So the computer metaphor helped with the resurgence of cognition, and so did technology. So now we didn't have to ask people what was happening in their brain. We could actually see what was going on in their brain with tools like functional MRIs. There was a lot of PET scans, CT scans, a lot of new technology that we're able to use to measure blood flow in the brain and consider that as an indirect measure of what we think is going on, what areas in the brain are active when we're doing certain tasks. So cognitive psychology is back. What do cognitive psychologists study? I did just what Dr. Horvath last week, what he did. I took some of the major areas of a textbook. These are the things that a cognitive psychology textbook covers. The one difference is that area, that's third topic of memory. The textbook that I'm using in cognitive psychology this semester has 4 chapters on memory. So memory is a huge part of cognition. We start with perception. There's even a chapter on kind of the history of cognitive psychology, and go through the topics in this order. I really haven't seen very many differences in textbooks. Usually there are a couple after language that look at decision making and problem solving too. So those are the areas that cognitive psychologists look at. It's widespread. There's actually a show that's currently on National Geographic Channel, and it's a cognitive psychologist, and it really makes cognitive psychology fun. They talk about all different types of topics like memory and attention, and it's a really neat series if you ever are flipping through the channels and happen to catch it. I am primarily interested as a cognitive psychologist in language, attention, and memory. Language was my area of focus in graduate school, and it wasn't an area that I anticipated studying in. I'll tell you how I got my job in that area. But at the time when I was studying it, so in the mid-90s, there was this book that became popular. And the author of the book, Steven Pinker, is a really great writer. So he's written a few New York Times bestsellers on the topic of cognitive psychology. Those two things usually don't go hand in hand. And he wrote this, and there was someone in the office that I was working in that had this book. And I read this passage, and I usually don't read things off the slide, but I will read this word for word. As you're reading these words, you're taking part in one of the wonders of the natural world. For you and I belong to a species with a remarkable ability. We can shape events in each other's brains with exquisite precision. I'm not referring to telepathy or mind control or obsessions of fringe science. Even in the depictions of believers, these are blunt instruments compared to an ability that is uncontroversially present in every one of us. That ability is language. Simply by making noises with our mouths, we can reliably cause precise and new combinations of ideas to arise in each other's minds. This ability comes so naturally that we're apt to forget what a miracle it is. And I read that and I thought, it's dramatic. It's a little dramatic. But it's really interesting. It really got me thinking about language. I was in this lab at the time called aphasia after stroke or close-end brain injury. They knew what they wanted to say, so they were capable of communicating, but do it. And I thought, wow, that would be maddening, number one. But when you think about languages and what it can do, it's really an amazing thing. Like, I can say, imagine a beach with a palm tree swinging and a hammock next to the waves as you sit there in the sun. And you can imagine it. You may not have even ever been to a beach, a palm tree before, but you can still imagine that. And language enables us to do that. I thought this is a really exciting thing. Language is one of those things that spans all the different areas of cognition. So we need to be able to store information, like the words that we're going to use. We need to be able to pay attention to what other people are saying to us so that when we respond in conversation, we're doing it appropriately, we're in tune with what they're saying. We need to be able to use our words to express what we'd like to do in decision-making processes and thinking. So there's a lot of overlap that kind of happens with all the different areas of psychology. But this was one of the things that really got me interested. Some of the things that I work on with students, you might be thinking it's kind of interesting, but what does it mean like in an everyday kind of active research process? So I have looked at factors that affect motivation in sports. I've looked at cognitive aspects of home field advantage. That's been really fun with student athletes. How language fluency changes in people with ADHD. And language fluency is just the rate at which you speak with and without error. So without error. And we find that in students, college students that we measured with ADHD, their rate of fluency is lower. You would never notice it, like if you were just having a normal conversation, but there's a statistical difference. You can compute it. It's not really noticeable to the ear, but when you measure it, it's an interesting find. And looking at things like how memory can vary based on advertising techniques. So consumer psychology, kind of crossing the bridge between what cognitive psychologists do and what IO psychologists do, what consumer psychologists do. Careers, it's kind of one of those things that you've probably been thinking, wow, it sounds like you can get a degree in psychology and do all kinds of things. That's the case. A lot of these careers that are listed here require graduate degrees. So certainly if you're going to go to artificial intelligence and robotics, you're going to need something other than cognitive psychology to be able to do that. That's something that's an interesting segue. And the segue that it comes from is because cognitive psychologists know how people process information. So that helps programmers plan the processes of flow and programming so that robots can mimic human actions. I don't know that there are any here that seem surprising to you, or if you have any questions about that, but I'll just leave that up there while I talk about my path, and then we'll see if there are any questions. So when I started college, I did not start as a psychology major. I started as a pre-med major. I went to Drexel in Philadelphia. Drexel is a huge engineering school. While I was there was even word that they were going to merge with the University of Pennsylvania. So Penn is right next door to Drexel, and that it was going to become the Drexel School of Engineering at Penn. It never happened. That was kind of a rumor at the time, but that's what it's like. So all students at Drexel, there are a couple of unique things about it. All students at Drexel are either grouped into kind of science students or non-science students. It is a very scientifically backed school. So even students who are art majors take a lot of science classes to look at kind of visual processing and all of that. Food science is a huge major there. Most students who go to Drexel go for 5 years. There's a co-op program, so and it's quarter system. So your first year there, you go for your fall, winter, and spring semesters, and you go home for summer. And then you come back your sophomore year, and 2 of the semesters you work in your co-op job, and 2 of the semesters you study. And you get paid for your co-op job. Most of the jobs there are paid, so that's also a different kind of thing. And you do that for 3 years, your sophomore, junior, and pre-junior year. And then your senior year, you go back and do 3 semesters and you graduate. It's really interesting the way it happens. There are a lot of students there. I believe the enrollment's around 15,000 undergraduates, plus tons. There's a medical school, law school, there's tons of graduate students. And for all of the undergrads, twice a year this happens where everyone's looking for a job. So it's a really interesting thing. It's done by a ranking system. So students, your first week of your freshman year of college, you're working on your resume and developing it, because by the end of the school year, you're going to be applying for jobs. You upload your resume and you choose places that you're interested in working. They review it and rank you and call you in for interviews if you're interested, and then you rank them after you interview, and they match people up. So it's kind of a neat process. You go through it 3 times while you're there. the first time I went through the process, I was a pre-med major. And I was in that cluster of students who were studying, taking classes for engineering, because that was like the natural science cluster. So my classes were things like calculus for engineers, biology for engineers. That's just the group that I was put into, which I learned was not the right group for me. But I started the co-op search process. There were lots of different jobs that were interesting to me. There were some manufacturing, kind of looking at biological components of pet food for big industry that makes food for animals. That was one that I went to interview for. I went to interview for a job at a big pharmaceutical company, so GlaxoSmithKline. That's a really big pharmaceutical company worldwide, but their headquarters is outside of Philadelphia. And I went there for an interview. And then I went for an interview at McNeil, Johnson & Johnson, McNeil Pharmaceutical. So if you ever heard of Johnson & Johnson, I'm sure everyone has. McNeil is their counterpart. They have what's called their OTC area of the company. OTC is just over the counter. So it's their over the counter pharmaceutical products. And McNeil makes Tylenol, kids Tylenol, Mylanta. Those are the big products that they make. So they make those, and then they also make all those like Johnson & Johnson's products. Like as soon as I hear Johnson, I think of like baby soap and stuff like that. They make that too. So I went to interview there, and it's a really interesting place. It was a place that I had never really seen before, not that I had been like a 19-year-old traveling around looking at manufacturing facilities, but I went there, and it's a huge campus. It looked like a city in and of itself. And what I learned was that it's not just where they make stuff. Everything was under one roof. Research and development, so scientists were there coming up with new products. All the marketing team, marketing was all under one roof. All the physical, the factory making of it and packaging was all there too. I learned that there are people who chose careers in what was called packaging engineering. Did you know that? Purdue has a huge packaging engineering program, and Drexel sends a lot of students too. Like those little things that you pop your medicine out of. Sometimes we need better packaging engineers, right? When you're like wrestling with that stuff, like how did they glue this together? My God, what did they use? That's all packaging engineering, so that nothing gets crushed or boned. So all of that was under one place. So that's a lot of people, like tons of people. I'd never been to a place that had like baseball fields and volleyball fields for their employees and a pool there and a gym, all this stuff. So when I interviewed for a very specific area of research and development. It was called sensory evaluation. It was brand new. Sensory evaluation was there as a new part of research and development to work on the development of creating better products that people would like when it comes to sensory issues. So let's think about it. Smell, taste, touch. So think about that when you're like taking medicine. If it's too chalky, like Mylanta, or if you're taking liquid cough medicine and it doesn't taste good, working on all of those things. So I interviewed for the job and I got the job, and it was a really, really interesting semester. I worked in a lab, and I would help the director of that area. It was only she and I come up with new ideas for what we'd want to look at. So we would do a new flavor of Mylanta, for instance, or a new flavor of children's Tylenol, and we'd test it against existing flavors. So we would have to do this from start to finish. We'd go into the lab and actually like follow the Mylanta recipe and mix it up. And then we would take these boxes of teeny little bottles, hundreds of them. I still have like nightmares of it, like unpacking things. And you couldn't, because this was for human consumption. There are really strict FDA guidelines, so I had to like sanitize the bottle. I had to take each one, and there was this gun of air and blow them all out because there's all these little like cardboard particles that fell in there, and then fill them. And then once all of that was done, I would go out to the cafeteria, where all of these people that worked in this one location were, and I would ask if they'd like to participate in an experiment. Would you like to participate in a taste test experiment? I'd give them like little trinkets for participating, and they'd do it and they'd give me the data. And then once they gave me the data, I would go back to the lab, and the woman who was the director was kind enough to, she was very, very patient, and she taught me about data analysis. Like, this is what we're going to do now. We're going to take this, we're going to see if there's a preference for one over the other. And it was, I loved it. I loved all of it because it was such a good mix of things. I was like doing chemistry stuff, and I was talking to lots of people all the time. It wasn't like I was in a lab all the time. I got to do the people part. I liked the data analysis stuff and answering questions and kind of working on problems. And I did that for a semester very happily, and went back to campus, and you go back and everyone asks what you did. And as I was talking to people on campus, they said, there was one person who said to me, I didn't know you were a psychology major. And I said, what about that job makes you think it had anything to do with psychology? And they said, well, like experimentation, data analysis. And I said, psychologists help people. They don't do that. I had no idea. I had no idea. I was done with my first year of college. I'd never taken a psychology class, was not interested in it at all because I thought it was only a clinical profession, a counseling profession. I looked into it as a sophomore in college does. Like, yeah, the course catalog looks pretty good. And I changed majors to psychology. So that was the first step. It was a really good change for me in terms of the coursework. I had gotten through the courses that I needed to in the first year, like biology and physics and calculus. I failed genetics 2 times. Not just once, 2 times. The second time I pretty much just gave up. But I could see kind of the path that I was taking, and the path needed to change. And once I realized that psychology was an option, that was so much of a better fit for me. So when I changed majors, I just did the regular thing. You start to do the coursework, but it was time for my second co-op job. I thought, how am I going to get a job in experimental psychology? But it turned out that there was a place that employed Drexel students during their co-op, and it was a place that was associated with Einstein Hospital. Einstein is a huge hospital network in Philadelphia, and they have an area there. It's called the Moss Rehabilitation Research Institute, MRI, and it's a rehab hospital. It's not like a rehab. Lindsay Lohan, I used to say her, but she's not even in the picture anymore. But you know what I mean. It's not that kind of rehab facility. It's rehabilitation for people after stroke, brain injury, closed head injury. So a lot of like typical kind of strokes, things that happen with aging population, and then other kinds of closed head injuries and open wound injuries. So like gunshot wounds. People who fell off roofs, people who fell off curb, head injuries happen in very strange ways. So that's where I went. And the Research Institute had tons of stuff going on. It was really at the beginning of it, but they had a few big name scientists who were there, and these scientists are bringing in grants. Like right now, there are probably 10 principal investigators that work there. They all do research. They do research with local universities that are there. So Temple is right down the street, Villanova is right there, Penn is right there, Drexel. So they have a lot of work that they do, collaborative work that they do with area universities. I worked in a lab that was doing research on aphasia. So aphasia is a disorder that occurs when there is disruption to the Broca's area of the brain. Broca's area of the brain is an area of the brain up in the front side, left side here, that when it's disrupted in some way, like blood flow is disrupted from a stroke, it prevents a person from being able to produce speech. So it's called production aphasia. There's another kind of aphasia when a different area of the brain is injured called Wernicke's aphasia, and that disrupts the ability of someone to comprehend language. So those two systems are separate, which is kind of interesting. So they can be preserved if there's injury. So I would work with these people, and I did really typical lab stuff. I was a lab assistant, a research assistant. I would help people, you know, like get off the bus when they came, and a lot of them were elderly, get to the facility, get them checked in, you have to keep good records when you're doing research, and then they would be tested, and I would help analyze data. A lot of it was transcribing what the patients would say. Transcribing in a phasics person's speech is not easy to do. It's a lot of expletive, So it's a lot of that and trying to keep track of that. But I did that and loved it. I loved like learning that there were these things out there. It was all kind of interesting to me. I got to participate in things like clinical rounds. So this was a place, this Moss was a place where really interesting cases would come that were unique. So people from all over the world would go there for treatment, and if it was a really unique case, the person was presented, the patient would be presented, and it was a round table, like a round table discussion. And around the table would be all different types of clinical practitioners. So it might be a neurologist and a psychologist and an occupational therapist, a physical therapist. And instead of everyone passing the file like this is going on, they had the opportunity to talk about the patient and their care all at one time. And I got to sit in on that and learn lots of stuff and saw lots of stuff that I think otherwise would have only read about in textbooks. So that was a really cool opportunity. I did my second co-op there, and then I went back into a different lab for my third co-op. I joke, I was there like 3 times in 3 different labs. It was like every year I'd go, and then I'd have a big thank you celebration dinner, and then I'd leave, and then I'd go back, and then the next year I'd have a big thank you, see you sometime in a later life, and I did that 3 times. But the other lab I did was looking at attention deficit after brain injury. That was really different work because the population of people that I worked with was quite different. So the brain injury that I saw, and the brain injuries just in general, if you're talking about who that happens to statistically, the most common group to be affected by brain injury are males from the ages of 18 to like 25. Guys from 18 to 25 do a lot of dangerous, stupid stuff. So, you know, jumping off, trying to jump in between buildings, jet ski accidents, skiing accidents, lots of motorcycle accidents. This was right around the time where helmet laws were changed. So at the time, helmets were required. They've since like kind of gone back and said they're not. When helmets were required, and it was really also the time where like crotch rockets were popular, you know, those motorcycles that are really fast. I don't know what they're officially called, that's probably not the official name of them, were really popular. So that speed combined with someone who's not really who's taking great risks and who's wearing a helmet is interesting because the helmet saves them, but they're still not in great shape. So those were the types of people that we were seeing. And I was really excited because we were looking at whether or not the drug Ritalin, what you've heard of for many years, that helps people with ADHD, whether or not that would be effective for people with brain injury. So it had never been studied. So people knew it was good for attention deficit, but would it really work? Is attention deficit in a person with a brain injury the same as a person with ADHD? So I was really excited about that. Here's what I wasn't excited about. I didn't realize what goes into the research. So you have to actually ask people to participate in your study. And the people that I had to ask were families of those who just had this really traumatic event occur in their life. And I was, you know, like 20 years old and was not used to doing this kind of thing. So I would have to go to the desk in the unit where the patients were and go through the books of records. There probably aren't books anymore, I'm guessing it's all electronic, but just like page through, and it'd be really interesting to read these people's medical history. And then I'd look for if there was someone who was a good candidate, and I would have to have a conversation with their family to ask if they could participate in an experiment where we were looking at attention. And I'd have to get consent, and that was a big learning experience for me. I think it was really good for me to do that. I did everything from that to taking the patient once they were signed up for the experiment, taking them to the building where the experiment took place, and then running the experiment. And most of the people that I worked with were in wheelchairs, and the experiment consisted of about a 30-minute script where I would follow the script while the patient was doing tasks, and they would be doing things like sorting things into bins, something that had a set goal. And at times throughout that, they were being videotaped, and at times throughout their tasks, I would interrupt them. So like at minute 1:30, get up and change the temperature of the thermostat. At 2 minutes and 20 seconds, make a phone call. At 3 minutes and 50 seconds, start to play Centipede on the computer. At 5 minutes, so I would do this and disrupt them. So every videotape that I had of every patient was the same. I thought, this is really cool. We're studying whether or not people stay on task. The participants had received the drug or placebo before then, and I didn't know which they got. So I had no idea whether or not they had the Ritalin or were just on a placebo. And then I took them back, and I thought, this is really interesting. I'm really glad I got to do this, and I thought that was the end of it. And then I graduated from college and didn't have a job and didn't apply for grad school in time because I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. So I stayed there. Well, I went back after I had my farewell dinner. And then I went back and continued to work in the lab, but that was a painful summer and fall, winter, a painful year. It was painful because I realized after collecting data from like 30 participants, someone had to analyze that data. And this was like in 1996, so nothing was automatic. So I had to sit in front of a TV with a video, with a VCR that had this toggle thing that you could toggle by frame, and an Excel spreadsheet next to it, and put 1 minute, 15 seconds. And there was a code. The patient's eyes moved. Back on task, away from task. Arm moved, away from task, back on task. And I did that for the 30 minutes, for every videotape, for every participant. That's how the data was measured. There are since machines that like can measure eye gaze and whether or not the person goes off track, can measure those things for you. I was the machine that did that summer. What I can say is that it was incredibly motivational for me to get the hell out of there. It was like, this is not what I do for the rest of my life. A lot of students say to me, I don't want to get a job because I might like it so much that I'll never go back to school. And I usually say, I don't know what kind of job you think you're going to get, but it's highly unlikely that the job's going to be so great that you're never going to want to go back to school. I certainly didn't have one of those. But what I did have, in addition to like a tedious task, was a group of cohorts that were in the same boat that I was. So as a student who graduates and may not know exactly what you want to do, getting a research assistantship, and there are tons of those across the country in big labs. We have a student right now who's at Harvard working with functional MRI testing. She wasn't sure, she got a job in the lab. Everyone who's working there, everyone's has goals, like long-term goals. Most of the time it's graduate school. And everyone wants to do that pretty soon. So there aren't any like 40-year-olds just saying, this is what I do. It's all people in the same cohort. So you're doing the same things, like, did you apply yet? Did you take the GRE yet? And there's that kind of culture to force you to get your act together if you're having trouble motivating yourself. And that was really helpful to me. I needed that support from other people. I realized that the people that I had worked with in the aphasia lab were basing their ideas for their experimentation on a theory that was developed by two people, one of whom was at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and the other one who was at Lehigh University. And Lehigh is about an hour from Philadelphia. It's right near where I grew up. It's a great place. And I thought, I'm going to go talk to him if he's taking graduate students. So that's kind of how my search for graduate school went. I went to talk to him and talked about the work that I did. And the first time I got there, I was really still interested in like the physiological kind of neuro stuff. So I was very nervous. I made an appointment. I went and we sat down. He was a very, very, very serious man, an Irish guy, Patrick O'Shea from Ireland. And he sat there and listened to me very contently, and then he said, I don't think this is a good program for you. And like my heart fell into my stomach. Like, oh, this is what I want to do, now what? I realize that now, retrospectively, that was his personality type, that he kind of wanted to push to learn more about why I thought it was a good fit. Some might say he was just being a jerk, maybe, I don't know. But it did work out that it was a good fit. I did apply to other schools. I applied mostly to master's programs. But what worked for me was that the program at Lehigh was a really small program. It was cognitive experimental psychology. They took approximately 5 students per year. They still do. Everyone that was accepted to the program was accepted with full scholarship and a stipend. I would not have been able to do that if that had not been the case, because part of the other story, and I shared a little bit about this when Sarah Fugia was here, but my dad died when I was an undergrad. It wasn't shocking, but like a 3-year illness. And already financially, college was difficult for me. So grad school wasn't even something that I considered. So that was something that allowed me to move forward with grad school. Or otherwise, I don't know that I would have been able to take that on as a full-time role. So I was able to do that. There are lots of programs that offer assistantships and full tuition. They're typically small programs, like cognitive psychology. Some IO programs do, some IO programs don't. Just thinking about that last week. Some counseling programs do, and regionally it changes a whole lot. So I know that Akron has assistantships. They don't do the tuition, pay for tuition. John Carroll, we have a student that's there now. She gets some tuition reimbursement, and she has an assistantship in the Count Center. So it differs by place, and it never hurts to ask. The other thing that I think is really important about kind of my path is that because of things like failing genetics 2 times, that doesn't do a whole lot of good for our GPA. And once you get yourself into that situation, it's super hard to dig yourself out. And then as you're looking and you see like, won't review applications with less than a 3.5 GPA, it's like, well, that can happen. Thinking like, what am I gonna do now? I was able to, there are 2 things that I did. One was, after I changed my major, things were a lot different. So I was able in letters that supplement your applicant material to highlight like, this is really the GPA you should be looking at, not this other stuff, and that was understandable for smaller programs. There are some programs that are so big, they just use that cutoff as like, not even gonna look further. But the other thing the reason that I believe I got a further look was because there was someone in the program that I was interested in working with, and that's what happens in graduate programs. So say you were interested in IO psychology, and you contacted Cleveland State. They only have 2 people in the program, but if you contacted and said, Dr. Horvath, I'm really interested in the research that you do on this, are you accepting grad students? If they are, then all of a sudden he's excited because he has someone who wants to work with him and is interested in his work. So that person typically serves as like an advocate for you. So when the department sits around and says, oh, Christine Turco, I don't know, what does everyone think? There's someone in the room that's like, she's a good candidate. It kind of sticks up for you. So those of you who might be in that precarious situation grade-wise, I always encourage that. And it's always a good thing to do anyway, because you want to go in to a program with someone that you're going to work with. So that is where I got to in graduate school. Even when I got to grad school, I did not think I was going to teach. I didn't want to teach. I didn't know anything about teaching. I was going to school to make money and get a good job. I thought I would do work in industry and research, And the person that had just graduated under my advisor, Pat O'Shea, he had just gotten a job with IBM working with computer programmers as a cognitive psychologist, consult, doing voice recognition stuff. So it was really popular then. I thought that is really cool. Like I really liked that. And that's what I was sure I was going to do, something like that. And the summer after I got my master's degree, I was allowed to teach, and I taught an intro class. And I thought, this is pretty great. Like I really like teaching. The other thing was that I realized that time is really important, and that was something that I was realizing. I think maybe I realized at a younger age than others because of my dad passing. My mom and dad worked like all the time, multiple jobs. You know, my mom is 69 and she's a secretary. My dad was a truck driver and he had all kinds of jobs. So they worked really, really hard without a lot of freedom and benefits. And I was seeing like, you can actually like come and go. You don't like clock in from 9 to 5 and you go and you get to hang out and talk to students and then go to an office and do things, and it's not the same thing every day. And I started to kind of change my mind about what I wanted to do. I started to realize that there was so much flexibility that if this was the path that I chose, that not only could I teach, but I'd be able to explore lots of different things through research, and that would change over the years, so I wouldn't always be doing the same thing. And I never really looked back after I got a job. But what I think helped me get a job too was always knowing that I was smart enough to fall back on something else. If that didn't work out, I knew that I could always do something, no matter what it had to be to get me to the next point. If I had to work as a custodian, I could do it. If I had to wait tables, I could do it. And I knew that, so that always made me less fearful, I think, of trying to do other things. So that, and then I came here. That's kind of a jump, but after working at Lafayette College, which is also on the East Coast, for 2 years as a visiting professor, I applied for full-time positions. And when you apply for a cognitive psychology position and limit the number of places that you apply to, I only applied to small private liberal arts schools, and I only applied to schools from like Pennsylvania across the top of the country. I ignored the bottom of the country. So that was like I applied to every job, and that was like 40 for every job in the country. So it's competitive. It brought me. I'm glad to be here. 10 years later. Does anyone have questions? None? All right. Would you stop that?
Yeah.
Thanks.